What is the most disturbing true crime story you know? Just got done reading Bodies in Barrels, the Snowtown Murders. Long story short, John Bunting, and with the help of a few friends, tortured, killed, and dismembered 11 people, putting their bodies in large plastic barrels and keeping them for years. By the end he had run out of room for them, so he rented an old bank and stored the barrels in the vault. John Bunting had no sense of smell, so he got caught when the stench eventually got so bad it permeated through vault and neighbors complained. Apparently he enjoyed stirring up the decomposing human soup. I left out a lot of details, but you should totally read the book, it's pretty good and pretty fricked up. He loved torturing people while playing recordings of previous tortured victims screaming. Freaking psycho. Magdalena Solis, the High Priestess of Blood. In 1963, brothers Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, a pair of petty criminals, devised a scam to swindle the population of the small farming town of Yerba Buena. They proclaimed themselves high priests of the old Inca gods and that they would bring bountiful harvests and treasure to the town in exchange for donations, food and sometimes sex. When the harvest and treasures failed to turn up, the villagers began to grow angry and suspicious. So the brothers went to Monterrey in search of a prostitute they could pay to act the part of a goddess in the farce, and made contact with Magdalena. What no one counted on was that Magdalena was insane and would quickly come to believe that she was indeed the priestess of the blood god. Only days after her arrival, Magdalena took over the cult and sacrificed 2 of the townsfolk. More human sacrifices followed and Magdalena began to drink the blood of the victims. She forced the Hernandez brothers to drink too, and soon they came to believe that she really was the awakened Inca god Cotlacu. For 6 weeks straight they butchered and consumed victims, with the surviving townsfolk sharing in the feast and blood orgies that followed. Only Magdalena was allowed to eat the hearts of the victims. In the middle of May, a 14-year-old kid named Sebastian Guerrero from a neighboring town investigated the weird fires and shouting coming from the cavern temple and saw dozens of people near naked, covered in blood, cutting themselves and eating the flesh of corpses impaled on pikes and scattered around on foot. He ran over 25 kilometers to the nearest police station and reported what he'd seen. The police did not take him seriously, but sent Officer Luis Martinez to take him back to the scene to make sure nothing was going on, and then drive him home. Neither of them were ever seen alive again. When Officer Martinez didn't come back, the rest of the police force called in backup from several local towns and went in force to the caves. Upon arrival they were attacked by the cultists, who had somehow attained obsidian knives and blades. Despite their ferocity, the officers managed to gun down most of them and were able to arrest what remained. They found a boy, Sebastian, dead on an altar. His heart had been eaten. The officer had been dismembered and one of the Hernandez brothers had also been mutilated and partially eaten. Solis, her remaining priests and 12 of the townsfolk were brought to trial on the 13th of June, 1963. Each of them received a prison sentence of 30 years, except Solis, who was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Solis still lives to this day. She has never recanted her belief that she is the avatar of Cotlacu, the blood god. Read a book titled I Have Life about a young lady in South Africa who was kidnapped, raped for hours, stabbed, almost decapitated and left for dead. She explains how she walked from the pull-off area to the road so she could get help, and suddenly couldn't see. It ended up being that her head was dislodging from its normal position and she had to hold her head on with one hand while holding her intestines with the other. Says what kept her going was the thought her family would know by the blood that she suffered. Humans are tough and there are some freaking monsters out there. Her name is Alison Boater. By all rights, she should not have survived the horrific attack. Not only did she survive, she also successfully identified her attackers. They were tried and convicted. Mary Vincent. Total bad but horrifying survival story. Mary was 15 years old, I think, hitchhiking in California hoping to get back home. Picked up by a pose who then raped her and cut off both of her arms and shoved her down a cliff. Mary freaking shoved her cut off arms into the mud to stop them from bleeding and hiked for hours and miles to the freeway. More to the story, but that is the basics. Mary is a warrior. Catherine Knight. She killed her husband, carefully chopped him up, cooked parts of him and was about to serve him to the kids for dinner when the police turned up. You left out the gnarliest part. She skinned him, and left his human pelt hanging up by a doorway inside the home. The officers who arrived on the scene had to push it aside to make sure the ground floor was clear, and they didn't realize what it even was until they found his skinless, headless body sitting in the next room. His head was in a stock pot on the stove. I don't remember the name, but I listened to a podcast about a hitchhiker getting kidnapped, but she managed to escape and the police would not believe she got kidnapped. Finally they pick up the guy on an unrelated charge and he just starts confessing. Turns out not only did he kidnap her, he had murdered a number of people but with no consistent style, so no one had even linked the murders. It really makes you wonder if there's prolific serial killers out there that just don't follow any patterns. Jennifer S. Benson is the survivor. The greatest serial killer from Brazil, Pedrinho Matador, allegedly murdered more than 100 people, 47 of them while in jail. One of them was, for example, his own father, that was also arrested for killing his mother. He also ate his father's heart at the occasion. Once, he was in the cell with another murderer, famous for raping his cellmate. Pedrinho, afraid of being raped, killed the guy at the first day. What a sick fuck. The murder of Jamie Bulger, a 2-year-old boy from Kirkby, Merseyside, England, who was abducted, tortured and killed by two 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, on Friday, the 12th of February 1993. They both got off lightly as well, and Venables was Similarly, the murder of Anna Kriegel in Ireland, a 14-year-old girl who was lured by two 13-year-old boys who raped and killed her. The two boys have never been publicly identified and it's an offense to share any information about their identities. Carla Homolka, part of the Ken and Barbie Colours. Her husband was sick, but I am deeply disturbed that she would participate in the drugging, rape, and murder of her own younger sister. Disgusting. And she had a very light sentence. Yup, and then she moved to Quebec, I believe Chateauguay. I remember the community was understandably upset when they heard her kid, S, would be attending their schools. Not the kid's fault, but the idea of running into her or having your kids near her just did not sit well with them. Joseph Fritzl. He imprisoned and raped his daughter and hid her off in the family cellar for 24 years. Had multiple children with her. I think some of them he'd pretend that the daughter, that he said ran away, left the baby on their doorstep for the family to take care of. It's been a while since I heard all the details about it, but it's royally messed up. My parents grew up in Colombia during the drug wars of the 80s. My dad's brother, who was 19 at the time, went out on a first date with a girl and a few hours later, family realized he didn't come back. The situation in Colombia was so tense at the time. If somebody was late, many people already started to assume the worst. After 2 days of not hearing from him after reporting to the police and getting nothing, my dad decided to drive to this river outside the city where many drug cartels dumped bodies. He found his brother's decomposing body along with the girl he went with. Turns out a friend of the girl he went with, who was also with them at the date, confessed that the three of them got kidnapped by the main girl's jealous ex-boyfriend, who had recently become a member of the cartels. He took them all into the mountains, castrated them all, then shot both my uncle and his date in the head. After that they dumped their bodies, and somehow the girl they went with got to escape and told the story days later on the news. Sadly, this is one of the hundreds of stories everybody who grew up in Colombia in the 80s knows. Holy frick, this made me sad. The Sitage Murderer. He enters the house, slaughter the whole family, chills at their home after that, eating ice cream and pooping. It was never solved. They have the killer's DNA on file. I think this one will eventually be solved by some family member of the murderer taking a DNA test and it being traced back to the killer, like how they caught that serial killer in California a few years ago. When I was pregnant with my youngest, my midwife was forced off the road, attacked and murdered on her way home from delivering a baby. When the suspect was finally arrested, he lived close enough to us that I could see the back of his house from my front porch. That haunted me for a long time. That's so scary. I hope you and your fam are okay, and that she is resting peacefully. That lady in Alabama who became jealous of another lady's pregnancy, killed her. cut out the baby and ran. I used to date a girl who knew the killer before it happened. That sort of thing doesn't happen a lot, but it happens a heck of a lot more than you'd really expect. Also been quite a few women murdered and their baby kidnapped when they were leaving a neonatal checkup. Tsutomu Miya, better known as the Otaku Killer, was a cannibal, child rapist and necrophile who murdered 4 young girls. He would write to the families of his victims telling them how he killed their daughters. To sum up one of the murders, a 4-year-old girl vanished while playing with her friend. Miyazaki had laid her under a bridge where they had a conversation that lasted half an hour. He then murdered her, where he then proceeded to have sex with her corpse. He then dumped her body in the hills near his home. He took her clothes with him. He let her body decompose. After that he came back to remove her hands and feet, which he kept in his closet. He burned the remaining bones, made it into powder, and sent it to her family. He also sent the family several of her teeth and pictures of her clothes and a postcard. It is a horrible case and it nearly made me cry. If you want another terrible case, look up Orm Shinrikyo. He was also the product of incest between his father and sister, who was also his mother. Charles Kennedy, a frontiersman living outside Elizabethtown, NN, with his Ute wife and child. After the conclusion of the Civil War, they set up a rest stop for travelers. Charles would register guests into the rest stop, maybe feed them some stew, then he would kill them and either burn or bury their bodies. In 1870, during a meal, a traveler asked if many Indians were in the area and Charles' son replied, "Can't you smell the one Papa put under the floor?" Well, Charles went on a rampage and went on to kill both the traveler and his own son, and he buried both of them under the floorboards. He locked his hysterical wife in the house and left. She eventually escaped through the chimney and ran 15 miles to town to get help. Gunfighter Clay Allison and a posse found Kennedy and threw him in jail. However, when there were rumors that Kennedy's lawyer was going to buy his freedom, it so disgusted the citizens that Clay Allison tied a rope around Charles' neck and had him dragged by horses to his death. The Wild West was freaking wild. This one never gets mentioned in these threads. Several kids were kidnapped and murdered in 1976 to 1977 in Michigan. The murderer would dress their bodies very nicely with freshly ironed clothes, and then display their bodies like trophies in easy to spot locations, sometimes right in front of a police station. When one boy was kidnapped, his mom was interviewed. She was an emotional wreck, obviously, and said she wanted her son back just so she could take him to get his favorite meal, Kentucky Fried Chicken. Several days pass and the boy is found, dead, displayed as a trophy with clean clothes and his belongings neatly placed beside him. When an autopsy was performed, they recorded the contents in his stomach. It was Kentucky Fried Chicken. The killer has never been identified or caught. Viola Liazzo. She was a Michigan housewife who believed strongly in the civil rights movement. She left her family to march on Selma and shuttle African Americans to protests in the polls. She was murdered by a carload of KKK members for betraying the race, one of which turned out to be an FBI informant. In order to shield the informant from guilt, the FBI spent the next 20 years putting out misinformation about her case and her death, going as far as to call her a prostitute, drug addict, and even a communist in the middle of the Red Scare. In reality, she was a devout Catholic and mother of 5 who had the audacity to think that equality was something worth fighting for. J. Edgar Hoover, the director at the time, personally relayed these false allegations to the goddamn president. He also blocked the convictions of KKK members who were guilty of bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. Evidence was so strong that a white jury in Alabama would have been forced to convict, but he didn't share any of the evidence and had the file sealed. He was a real piece of crap. If by true crime you mean like a crime that happened. A few years ago I worked at a call center and one guy on my team who was probably 40ish started talking to me and the other guys who were all early 20s about Call of Duty. Well, turns out he and I are both into guns too. I'm like, heck yeah, I just made a friend. So he invites me to his house to shoot one day and like we kicked it, man, just had a friendly day. So a few weeks of working together he asks where I live and when I tell him he tells me his parents used to live down the street. I asked if they moved and he dead but tells me this story. His perspective. My parents lived about a mile or 2 down from you. They didn't move. What happened was my sister and her boyfriend wanted money, so they killed my mother in her sleep and waited for my father to come home and shot and killed him. They tried to bury one and burn the other but were unsuccessful and got caught. My sister is actually up for parole next year but her BF is doing life. They had an episode of some A&E crime show on it a few years ago when it happened. Holy crap yo, I was weirded the frick out at that. My neighbor was a famous restaurant owner. It was a huge story. She conspired with her boyfriend to kill her husband. She bought him a motorcycle and he used it to commit the drive-by shooting. They both went to jail, but she ended up getting out after some time because of an appeal or something. It's always weird knowing right next door is a wealthy woman who killed her own husband. These are the sorts of crimes Columbo solves. I was a male clerk in a military criminal investigations headquarters. We got case files from air bases from all over. It was a boring job and we would read the cases to pass the time. One came in from the Philippines. An Air Force woman was in town sightseeing and an Air Force man from her organization met her on the street. He put a gun in her ribs and made her go with him to a hotel. He spent the next couple of days raping her in all possible ways. He used and opened bottles on her and twice went down on the street and brought back groups of men to have sex with her. There were other things but they have slipped my mind. He finally took her out and on the street she managed to get away and ran to a cop very close by. He got 20 years in prison and the rumor was he did 3 years, got paroled and was supposed to have raped and killed. There was a case that was the opposite of Ken McElroy, the bully who got murdered in front of dozens of witnesses and no one saw anything. This other case involved several bullies who targeted two brothers constantly and ended with the bullies kidnapping and beating them in front of witnesses. That escalated to the brothers being tied up, tossed in the back of a pickup truck and paraded around town before they were eventually shot. None of the witnesses called the police even though the final incident went on for several days. This is terrible. Tika Adams, who was 7 months pregnant, was lured to an apartment under the pretense of free baby clothes. She was held captive for 3 days, beaten and the woman tried to cut the baby out of her. To escape, Tika had to step over the sleeping woman. She made a noise and was dripping blood onto her but she didn't wake up and had to hold her intestines so they wouldn't fall out. It was so bad that I think the EMT passed out on the scene. Tika Adams and her baby survived. The Toolbox Colours. They recorded on tapes the sounds of them torturing their victims. The tapes have never been released to the public, but snippets of them could be heard on old news recordings of the day they played them in court. The tapes were so emotionally jarring people got up and walked out of the courtroom, many of which were in tears. Jurors were even putting papers up in front of their faces to hide their tears. I think I also heard that the FBI used to play the tapes for new agents so they could get a grasp on some of the awful things they'd see here during their careers. Of all the awful crap I've ever seen on the internet, this got to me the most. Truly awful. I'm sure some may go look for the old news videos, but I strongly caution everyone with looking up transcripts of the tapes. My mom tells a story about her aunt and uncle having their home invaded. So it was a group of guys who'd escaped prison and were high and trying to hide out. They also wanted money to get more drugs supposedly. They broke into their house and duct taped them to chairs then pumped them full of drugs. My great uncle escaped but couldn't get his wife out of their burning home so she probably wasn't dead when the fire started and probably just couldn't escape like my great uncle did. He was horribly disfigured from the fire and obviously mentally scarred by not being able to rescue his wife from the fire. I cannot find articles about the incident as it happened in a small town back in 1994 but if anyone knows about a prison break in 94 in rural New Mexico then it's potentially connected. The guy who did it and got out of prison was in a video about a rehabilitation job where ex-cons sell donuts. My mom saw him and started freaking out rightfully, which is why I heard the story the first time. I think as it's a pretty fricked up true crime story that hits close to home. I also can't remember the video where the one dude got out of prison but if I shared that video his name would be attached to the story and I don't feel comfortable doing that anyway. The story of the world's youngest serial killer, Amajit Sada. I don't remember everything but he lived in a town in India where I believe about half of the population were his extended relatives. He killed 2 younger children in his family and the family kept it on the DL until he killed someone outside of his family when one of his aunts, I think, brought the parent of the 3rd child to Amajit and said he had killed them. He was arrested at 8 years old. Reminds me of Mary Bell. The Shannon Watts case. It was horrible. Kept me awake for several nights trying to understand how someone could do something so wicked to his own family. I still don't understand. We will probably never know. I worked with Chris in Platteville when this happened. Still can't bring myself to watch the Netflix movie. Frick that guy. A little girl was tortured, starved, shot with pellet guns, made to eat vomit and dismembered. The only reason anything was found out was because the house those two monsters were living in got a new tenant who noticed a horrid stench. They found parts of her in a wall, and the rest of her was dumped in a shallow grave in the vicinity of a garbage dump. Catherine Mary Knight, born the 24th of October 1955, is the first Australian woman to be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. She was convicted for the murder of her partner, John Charles Thomas Price, in February 2000, and is currently imprisoned at the Silverwater Women's Correctional Centre in New South Wales. Knight stabbed Price to death, skinned him, then put his skin on a meat hook and cooked his head and parts of his body with the intention of feeding them to his children. Jodi Arias. Very disturbing case. She was meant to go on a business trip with her boyfriend, maybe ex at the time, to Cancun. However, he asked to change his travel companion to a female friend instead. Therefore she murdered him by stabbing him 28 times, slicing his throat from ear to ear, then shooting him in the left cheek. Then proceeded to travel across state right after to her ex-boyfriend for a hookup. Her defense in the trial was labeling him as a control freak, abuser, and child pedophile, and that she had to shoot him in self-defense when he lunged at her. Pathological liar, and she still lies about the incident now while she is serving life in prison. I felt sick seeing her deny everything so many times. She's a crazy psycho, be honestly. It happened on a reservation that I grew up on. Nice quiet native kid who was a bit standoffish but never a jerk was called to the office one day. Murders on reservations are handled by the FBI. At least that was the case when I was growing up. Anyways, he apparently was told by these FBI agents that his grandmother was found murdered. I guess they asked him if he had any information and he confessed everything. It came out that his grandmother was an alcoholic drunk that would beat this kid all the time. Grandparents tended to raise the children on the res. He got sick of it and snapped. He waited till she passed out one night, tied her up and dragged her outside. He buried her in some strange position, bit up to her neck with just her head sticking out, next to an anthill. When the sun came up, he cut off her eyelids and the red ants went at her. I never heard what the actual cause of death was, so this freaked the whole freaking town out. Very small town. By lunchtime, the story had gotten around our high school and the businesses in town. Our teachers announced at the end of lunchtime that school was going to be closed the next day, Friday, but we had to be back on Monday. The news was just disrupting everything. I remember going to the local trading post and the look of shock on the faces of the elders sitting on the benches in front of the store. In the store, people were talking in whispers. Everyone was in shock. It was like this happened to your own grandmother or something. Crap like this hadn't happened in a long time. Just writing this down, I'm chilled all over by it. We obviously never saw the kid again. He was a sophomore, but that story haunted daily conversations until I left the res a few years later. I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, but here's one from my own life. When I was about 12 or so, there was a single woman who lived on my street, probably no more than 100 yards down from my house. She had recently gotten engaged and was planning on selling her house to move in with her fiance. After an open house, a potential buyer asked to come by and view the house again privately, as he claimed to be very interested. It was actually an unnaturally dark and stormy day when the man came for his viewing. A few days later, a fellow neighbor became concerned because the woman used to take her 2 dogs on morning walks with this neighbor and a few others, and they had not been able to get a hold of her. She had a key to the woman's house for dog sitting purposes and decided to let herself in. The first thing she noticed was the dogs were terribly stressed, running all over the house crying as she came in. They had also peed all over the living room. She walked through the home calling the woman's name to no response until finally she made it to the master bedroom. There in the master closet she found her, clearly raped and strangled to death. I still remember coming home from soccer practice that day and seeing tons of police out in front of the house. The guy was actually caught pretty quickly because, get this, The realtor helping with the open house talked to this guy during the event and was so creeped out by him she actually kept a brochure he had held and they were able to get his fingerprints. Turns out he had recently gotten out of prison for assaulting several other women. I still think about how terrifying it must have been for that woman as this guy viciously attacked her alone in her home during a terrible thunderstorm. So, there you go. Now you can be afraid of selling your house on top of whatever other illogical fears you may already have. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.